Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining, and welcome to this year's last episode of Action Items with Let's Talk Supply Chain, brought to you by NewGenArchitects, your partner in digital transformation and supply chain transformation. Thank you, everyone, for a great year of the show. Wonderful first year. We've gotten a lot of engagement. We've had a lot of regular guests, a lot of new guests, a lot of engagement in the comments and rewatches. And I am so grateful for all of you guys. And we will be doing this again next year. So be on the lookout, of course, for more LinkedIn events. We're always live on YouTube and Facebook as well. And then you can always catch the recording. So make sure you go to letstalksupplychain.com to register for email notifications. And don't ever miss an episode unless you have to. And then again, you can watch the recording. So today I am joined by Nikki Gonzales of QuoteBeam. And I am very excited to be talking about a topic that is top of mind, I'm sure, for a lot of people. I know within the supply chain community, procurement, et cetera, we're always talking about bringing value to our customer, to the organization, to our companies. And it's not always about cost, but sometimes it is. Let's be honest, sometimes it is about cost and reducing cost of goods sold, et cetera. And today I'm going to be talking with Nikki about how we can do that within our companies, within our teams, using automation and how to go about automating. I wish I had kept the article. I didn't, but we do know from a couple of studies that almost half of companies who already had some sort of digital transformation or technology-driven transformation on the roadmap, software implementations, digital automation, et cetera, for 2023, despite economic outlooks, are going to continue to be looking to implement those tools and optimize processes using technology. We want to convince the other half that you should be doing it as well. So let's go ahead and bring up Nikki to the stage.
Hi, Dyci. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for joining. I know this was kind of last minute.
That's okay. I've been a fan of the show. I've watched as much as I can, and it was just very exciting to get the invite. So I'm not normally a morning person, but hey, I woke up early for you.
You know what's funny? I'm not a morning person either, and I wake up early for my own show. I kind of roll out of bed, do something with my hair, put on glasses so that it makes me look not as if I just rolled out of bed.
Yeah, that's what I got hats for.
So before we get started, Nikki, tell us a little bit about your background. You have a very extensive background in supply chain, and you spent some time at Algo. So the technology, it's kind of in your blood. You're doing some cool things at QuoteBeam, trying to, if I'm not mistaken, get distributors, onto like e-commerce and using some more digital tools to really streamline those business processes. So from in your words, what is it that you do?
Sure. I actually had lunch with someone the other day, and after about 25 minutes, he said, "Wait, have I met 5 people? What do you not do?" My interests are varied, but very much centered around automation in different ways. And so I actually started out as a field sales engineer for industrial automation equipment on the factory floor. I started with machine vision systems, which were very much coming in to usually automate quality inspection in a plant that traditionally has been done by spot checking, checking 1 out of every X number of samples for a quality problem, or replacing potentially or augmenting a person that tries their hardest, God bless their hearts, to stand there and watch every product go by and make sure that there isn't something wrong with them. And ideally catching that before you potentially ship out a pallet of bad product that's going to cost you a lot of time and money. So early on in my career, I did a ton of application engineering for that sort of hardware, setting up the lighting and the cameras and developing the software programs that would correctly, accurately, detect a defect, kick out the product, tell the right person, stop the process, make some change upstream. Because usually when companies were investing in this type of technology, it was because they had a very costly problem before. Usually, or unfortunately, it takes that sort of event to go, hey, maybe we should spend some money on upgrading this or automating it, not just because it's cheaper, because we can now repurpose this person's time for something more valuable, or maybe we don't need as much of a headcount on this line. But also, hey, this actually cost us, millions of dollars because we shipped pallets of bad product, or somebody got sick because there was a foreign object in, or the packaging wasn't closed and bacteria got into food products. I mean, there are just so many different things that in the supply chain of making and delivering a product can cause an issue that can be very costly if you don't catch it ahead of time. But me being me, and I'm very curious, I always like to learn. Once I really got the hang of the vision systems, I just had a hard time sticking to my lane, right? I would walk into a factory and looking at automating one process.
When you see a problem, you want to solve it.
Then I look a little bit
and problems aren't just right here in front of you, they're everywhere.
Yeah, and I'm like, well, what about this thing that happens before this thing gets over here? We need to do something about that too. And so I sort of found myself open for opportunities once I had been doing that for 3 years. And I was offered a job with a company called Festo that does handling and robotic systems and motors. And so a lot of the things that were happening before and after my vision inspection. And I thought, hey, what a great opportunity for me to expand my knowledge on the production line into how can we more efficiently handle product? How can we automate something that it maybe is manually done today on the factory floor? And we looked at a lot of, when we would spec up a project, what is the ROI of this, right? It's not just the hardware that's involved. That's a bill of materials cost. Then there's the integration cost. Then there's the time it takes to, put it together, and then making sure that it works properly and that everybody's trained around it. And there's change management around that. But how do we look at, is it worth automating this process? Or maybe does it make sense to keep doing it manually or semi-manually? Which oftentimes there can be sort of smaller bites that you can take that really make a big impact on ROI without a big risk of a big project that might go wrong. And I ended up then going into software for electronics design, doing virtual prototyping of electronics. So part of my customer base when I was doing factory automation was electronics manufacturers, making, your cell phones and routers. And I worked in the San Francisco Bay Area. So a lot of Silicon Valley, hardware manufacturers, well-known brand names that you might know. And thinking again, how do we stop these costly problems from happening? How do we, get more smarts further up in the chain? And so I ended up working with the software that does physics simulation for virtual prototyping of hardware designs. Particularly, we worked a lot with antenna design. So where exactly do you put an antenna in a cell phone so that it's not obstructed by other things, so it gets the best signal no matter where you are? And instead of having to make 100 different prototypes with the antenna in a slightly different position and testing them all, the software would just simulate the waves, how the antenna would behave, and then run optimization algorithms to say, okay, actually, if you position it right here, and we're going to run through all the different scenarios, here's the Pareto curve, and here's where your optimal positioning is going to be. Or, the number of components that you put on a board, how is that going to be? What's the most cost-effective way to meet your design spec with the least amount of hardware, part number deviations, those sorts of things. So looking into, even before we manufacture things, how do we make it cheaper and more reliable to manufacture? And maybe reduce the BOM complexity even. If you can standardize on a fewer number of components, that can be very helpful in certain scenarios. So I've thought about this whole manufacturing design to manufacturing supply chain a lot during those, 10 years. And then I ended up personally, I left that job and I really wanted to figure out what startups are doing, because I worked for companies that were kind of, had been around for a very long time, had somewhat outdated IT systems themselves, which I always thought was a fun or funny dichotomy in the tech industry. We sell high-tech software to the smartest engineers on the planet, and we use like a 5-year-old out-of-date CRM system where I can't segment my customer data and send out, invites to the right workshop, to the right customer. And like I said, I can't look at a problem and be told, well, that's just how we do it. We're not going to solve it. I will eventually either I need to solve it or I need to move on. So I ended up working with a variety of different startups, just freelancing. I really wanted to learn from them, like what are all the latest tools that are out there, because startups, they use other startups' products a lot, right? Because they want that new innovation. They want things that are leaner, that are easier to use, that get you more bang for your buck. So I worked for a few different hardware and software startups. And I got introduced through one of my old customers to Algo. And they were doing supply chain analytics and forecasting and using a lot of machine learning and data analytics to do some basic BI stuff in some cases, which some companies really need. And in other cases, going as far as doing RPA for very complex processes, using basically as a service, taking all of their disparate data, adding third-party data, and then doing, some predictions and starting to really work with them on the digital transformation of things like demand planning and sales and operations. And I
personally feel like gets a lot more love than a lot of what you've been talking about.
Yeah.
The production, the innovation and design. I wrote that down because I feel like I don't hear enough people talk about, why don't we design it better before we even get to the point of trying, like, as we design it, we figure out how is this even going to fit best on a pallet? How is it going to fit best in a box? How do we reduce the packaging material and design it in a way that we can do that? A lot of people, I don't hear enough conversation about where the innovation and the product design and R&D plays into supply chain cost. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that, and I wrote it down and I circled it because I wanted to really highlight it. And maybe I'll do an episode about it. Maybe I'll do an episode about it, and we'll dive into it a little bit more. But yes, you were Algo, demand planning, BI, S&OP. So what's funny? You haven't talked about, much of, the freight and distribution side of it, but you're now working with distributors, right?
Yeah. So that was,
you are maybe the only person that I know, like when you say end-to-end supply chain, has actually done end-to-end supply chain from product design to distribute it to the customer. And, after sales and service, et cetera. It's like truly the full life cycle of the product.
Yeah, I even do RMAs right now.
So
talk about restocking fees
and in supply chain expert.
And we're actually doing things, and this was not in our business plan at all, but enabling circular economy by allowing a lot of our customers to sell back their excess stock.
Oh, cool.
Because they're just with the supply chain disruptions right now, there are some components that are in such short supply that, surplus stock has become almost as desirable as anything else, just because you use what you can get if you can't get something.
Right.
And it's unfortunate that it has come to this to push, players in the industry. And in my industry that I sit in right now is this industrial automation. So it's funny because I'm supporting the supply chain of the industry that provides the automation capability, hardware wise, to the manufacturers that I used to sell. And so it's a funny thing. I used to think, and I was often told when I would switch when I switched from machine vision to pneumatics and handling, or then, to electromagnetic simulation software, usually my colleagues were like, what the heck are you doing? Like, you don't know anything about that. It's not, why do you always keep switching to something new? And I was like, well, I really want to learn something.
Yeah, exactly. I get it.
To me, it connects. To me, it's like there's a lot of things like that my skills transfer. And then at the same time, what I learned in my old job is actually useful in the new one. But they were seemingly disconnected at the time, right? Machine vision, then handling, then design automation, then the supply chain so we were dealing with mainly vendor managed inventory in retail when I was at Algo. Entertainment products for the most part in terms of category. We had other categories, appliances and some other things but we really had a big customer base in entertainment, which is like, okay, looking at movie titles at, different Walmarts and Best Buys. It's a different market, but a lot of these processes and these problems are the same no matter what industry you're in, right? Whether you're distributing product to 100 regional distributors or you're selling directly into retail stores, it's you have these nodes of the supply chain, right? And if they're not connected or you're not getting data from all levels that you can look at, then there's a lot of inefficiency in the system.
And it reminds me of my really bad experience this week. As you commented on LinkedIn.
Oh, yeah.
With my office chair.
Yeah.
And I was like, dude, where was the data breakdown here? At what node of the supply chain was I allowed to make an order for a product that was out of stock, and it took someone 3 weeks to realize that it was out of stock and to cancel my order? Like, who had the data point? Which system didn't talk to which system? And, what did it make? Which is, again, you talked about, these large enterprise organizations that are making hundreds of millions, billions of dollars. And, we know the value. We know why you would imagine that they also know. And the only thing that I can think, I have tried to, as a consultant, become very gracious and less judgmental. It's very easy to look from the outside in and say, why aren't they doing this? Why aren't they doing this? But I do like to generally believe, and from what I found is if I go into a situation and I just keep my mouth shut and I just ask questions and observe, that many times everyone else recognizes it's not the best thing. But at the time, we were stuck between a rock and a hard place. And this was the least bad option. And, going back to like my academics and like statistically speaking, we want to be able in 95% of situations to cover this. The other 5%, it just is what it is. We can't be 100% at all times. So I like to rant in my little individual situation. But I mean, there could be a very valid reason. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And that's the thing right now, especially like you said in your post, like we all know the situation. So it's very easy to justify the breakdown of the initial breakdown, which was products not available. It was out of stock. Yes, they probably could have done a better job recognizing that earlier. But to me, what is really the learning that everybody can get from that sort of situation is not that we can all fix our supply chain communication overnight, but you can fix your customer communication overnight. You should. That is
a lot of people underestimate the role customer service plays in the supply chain.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that I'm so passionate about advocating for automation is that right now, and one of the reasons this may be the case, again, they just have too many other priorities, too many fires to fight, that even though they might know that a better customer service response email is necessary, it might be lower on their priority list because we don't know what other, very important, very strategic or very big, whatever problems they might have. But the more we can automate the 90% or 85% of what I would call like happy path things that should not require an exception intervention handling, if we can automate those things, then we can take a lot of the day-to-day stress off of people to get to focus on some of those things that maybe are not as big of a volume of a problem, as in not as something you have to do 100 times a day, but then you can handle the 5 things that, really need that extra attention properly. Instead of right now, it's kind of the other way around. People are so inundated with tasks that maybe could be automated, and they're behind. And so all of the slightly different anomalous things that they have to deal with and should deal with more carefully actually fall below the line of getting done rather than getting special attention, which is what they should do.
Exactly.
And the fact that they weren't able to follow up or say, hey, we're so sorry that this happened. Here are some alternatives that we can recommend to you.
Right.
Or just, here's a coupon or something to acknowledge that, like, yeah, your time was wasted here.
Yes. And also, we want your business.
Yeah, exactly.
We do want your business. We do want you to buy something else. So here is, like you said, here's, even if it's $5 off, it's the gesture.
Yes, exactly.
It's the idea that you care about me as a customer and you want me to continue to do business with you. But even just from a, top line revenue perspective as a company, I would prefer to have, $5 less in revenue, but still keep the customer, as opposed to losing the entire sale. So a lot of, kind of what you said, there is low hanging fruit. And I think that sometimes when we talk about automation, the word automation within the context of the supply chain, especially for manufacturers, people think of this like crazy, what is Apple doing? What is Amazon doing? We're going to do that. And it's like, no, it's some of the low hanging fruit that you don't realize is having a really high impact. It's low complexity. And it's low level of effort to automate with some startup tool who has figured out that this is a problem. And it can have a high impact in terms of cost avoidance, quality assurance, a lot of different things that you talked about earlier, which kind of brings us to our first action item of, when you're considering which processes are, trying to figure out which are those low-hanging fruit and should you automate, because you also mentioned, Nikki, which I really love, we're not saying go automate it all.
Right.
It's a very strong possibility that you will get some gains just from going through the process of saying, what if we were going to automate it? The first thing we're going to do is define and standardize the process. So as we define and standardize the process, we can figure out, everyone, not just Nikki, who has the all-seeing eye and can connect all the dots, but everyone can see, oh, wow, these things are connected. And I thought that I was just doing this, but since I was no overall team, company, cross-departmental, cross-functional definition and standardization of the process, I didn't know that this was happening upstream, which affected me being delayed, or me doing this thing, which is an alteration to what I was told to do, but makes my life easier. So I just changed it without telling anybody. It's actually causing delays and heartburn downstream. So when people put their own little tweaks on things, when you ask 4 different engineers how something is done and you get 6 different answers, because it depends on the day, depends on if we're behind, depends on this, depends on that, you can't automate that. So what are some good tips and tricks, or one, that you would give to say, like, hey, this is a good way to go about just defining and standardizing some of the processes from all of your varied experience?
I'll draw on a recent example that we did internally. We automate a lot of things at Copium, because anyway, I won't go into the whys. I know why by now. But we found a pretty good way to look at the way that we did it, or do it most recently, is we'll get like a Miro board or something together, and get the stakeholders together in a Zoom meeting, the people that touch the process, right? And it may not, of course, be everybody that does it, but some representative from every sort of group that handles or touches that process so that they can give their input. And then just make a flow chart. Make a simple flow chart that tracks the path of what do you do? What are the inputs and outputs to this process? And just walking through that first iteration of, okay, this is the first step of what happens. This is, what I do next. And if this happens, here's where I go. Once you start building that out, you'll find out how many people don't agree on how it's done, or how, wait, why are we doing this way? What is it that prompts this to happen here? And then you can start looking at, okay, how much, and the way that we kind of define what we automate is we understand we're probably never going to get to 100% of the process, 100% of the cases, right? It depends on if you're looking at a small part of a process, then yeah, you could probably automate it 100%. But the more pieces of a chain you're looking at, the less likely it is that you'll completely fully automate them. Because this also can be very scary, depending on what you use to automate. Like if you're looking at, oftentimes AI algorithms can automate a lot more than, discrete rules-based stuff. But then you have like a lot of ethics and other things to figure out how is it really working, what does it do when it makes the wrong decision, those sorts of things. So we like to really look at break it out into the smallest building blocks possible, to where you still have some, you have to include upstream and downstream a little bit, because you can never do take a process completely in a silo. But try to take a small chunk and get everybody that works around that chunk of process together in a room, put it together in a flow chart. And then what you'll probably find again is you'll start to come up with more and more and more exceptions to that process.
Right.
And then you try to quantify, okay, how much of the process actually is exception? Is it 95% it goes through the path that it should, and only 5% do we have all these edge cases? Or are we looking at a process that currently is like 50% one way or the other? And then how complex is it to make a decision tree or to manually, map the process? And if it's pretty well defined and there isn't like a person making a judgment call, you could potentially have, a decision tree that just leads you down the path. And that's going to be probably a great process to automate to start with, because you can see how it's done. It's mostly done the same way. And if you automated that 85 to 90% of the time, and you have a way to make sure that an exception gets kicked out to a person the right way in a timely manner and doesn't just get caught in some, okay, it's not, it's going to stop the process or whatever, then you probably have a great candidate for automating. And then you have to look at, okay, how do we automate it, and what is the best process for that, and how, what is the cost for that, and how much time is it going to save, or how much more is it going to improve the bottom line, or how much more is it going to make our customers happy? Because sometimes it can, the results, the way we've looked at ROI for automation for a long time has been kind of like, oh, we can, look at one person does this and they make this much per hour. And if we automate it, we'll take 2 years of this person's salary is gone. And now that's going to be our, ROI period. That is the most basic, very simplistic, not holistic way to look at the ROI of automation. Because again, systems, right? There's a lot of inputs and outputs. And sometimes if you can automate a process to get better quality or more consistency, and your customers generally are going to be happier with your product, then that results in increased customer loyalty, probably higher margins for your product because you have less returns to deal with, you have less customer churn. So, look at as well, try to think about what's our base cost of doing this process, but what are the peripheral things that are upstream and downstream from this process that would be affected by the process being more streamlined, done better. Or in the case of I deal with a lot of inside salespeople at distributors. And when they manually process orders and quotes, they're so inundated with requests that they don't have time to build relationships with their customers. You might as well call them.
It becomes very transactional and just, hey, let me get it done. And there's no opportunity to maybe upsell or provide more value or understand what the customer is really looking for, or understand where they're taking their business somewhere else and what part of business you're getting. So
yeah. So when you're looking at that process, definitely look at it from a process point of view. This is how it's done, but also think, okay, when this, because we're also talking about exceptions, right? Because if you have a process that is not standardized at all, then it's harder to automate, right? Or it brings less value. But also make sure to look at what is the peripheral effect of your current process being bad, and how much more could we, have an outsized impact, let's say, on customer satisfaction. by automating it. If it has nothing to do with, what the customer sees in the end, then, it's a little bit more streamlined to look at the costs. But it's again, more than just, this person per hour that does this process.
Right. There are a couple of things, and then we have a comment also. So first of all, Nicole, we can go ahead and flash the next two action items because Nikki has actually touched on those a little bit. So documenting the process, once it's standardized, you document it. And then after you document, you calculate the cost of the process. And you understand, and from cost, not just like you said, the hourly, or this is how much it costs us to do it, but what is the cost of it going wrong? What is the cost of people deviating from what we have documented? What is the opportunity cost of us missing these opportunities to build relationships with our customers because our salespeople are just doing it? So that's the first thing. I wanted to just go ahead and flash those and give those nuggets. But also, I want to highlight something you said, thinking about the inputs and the outputs and bringing everybody in a room together. I've been involved with a couple of situations where we say as a team, let's sit down and document these processes, and we take this department and then this department and then this department, and then you try to bring it all together, and it's like, oh, but no one seems to actually agree on what's happening. So if you start from the beginning, I really like that you said when you get everyone in the room together, you realize how much people don't agree on what the process is. And I think it's really important to call out that as you are going through the standardization, documentation, definition of what the process should be, to not get too hung up on, oh, we don't agree with it, or this person does that, they find it better. Start with something. And that's where continuous improvement comes in, which is, maybe like second grade or third grade. And we're in kindergarten, first grade right now. But the idea of just because you are doing it one way now doesn't mean that you can't change it. And you will probably change it anyway. KPMG, I do remember where that came from. KPMG did a change management study and found that most businesses change every 2 to 5 years. And that's because there are external factors that don't affect, that you did not think about, that affect your business, that you didn't plan for. So you have to pivot, and you might have to change, or new technology comes out, or you need to upsize, you need to downsize your team. There are lots of different things that could be the catalyst to that process having to change anyway. So don't get stuck in analysis paralysis and no one agrees on it. If you can agree mostly, just do it. And then know that, okay, in a couple of years, or let's monitor it, let's figure out what that, plan, do, check, act phase of evaluation is going to be, but don't get stuck in it. Another comment. First of all, good evening, Tanzania. Good morning, Texas, Chicago, etc. Bernard Brown. Many of the automated orders have to be resubmitted because of data integrity issues and API calls from internal systems. At what point is automation good if it still requires a person to hop on, fix, manually input data if it doesn't translate properly? I have an opinion about this. What do you want to hear my opinion first, or you want to hear your opinion?
I don't care. I have an opinion too.
So my opinion is that when you're part of standardizing and documenting the process, those inputs and outputs is understanding the underlying data.
Yeah.
If you're doing that properly, you shouldn't get to the point to where you've automated something with bad data.
Yeah.
That defeats the entire purpose. Unfortunately, Bernard's experience is not, a one-off exception. It happens very often to where people say, oh, we want to automate something. Let's go do it. Let's go get demos. Let's go talk to vendors. And in this conversation, it has been very intentional that Nikki and I have not mentioned finding vendors. We have not talked about that yet. We standardize the process, we document the process, we calculate the cost of the process, and maybe we decide not to automate the process after all. And data could be one of those reasons. It could be that we just don't have the data to a point to where it makes sense to automate right now.
Absolutely. No, you're totally right. And that's where looking at that process together, right? And what the inputs and outputs are. And if somebody's deviating from what the process should be, there's usually an underlying reason for that. And often it's a workaround because something else is crap.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the inputs, right? Or and it's for that individual contributor, it's cumbersome or not possible to change the input that they, or that the input that's coming to you. So you end up doing a workaround, right? If your data is bad in your ERP and you're not the person that can overhaul that, then you figure out how to work around that, right? But then that is a bad process to automate because you have not fixed what's causing your problem of having to have all these workarounds. And you shouldn't be doing the process the way it's done because you're doing that to fix an underlying problem.
Right.
And that's one of the things that in my experience, like with Algo, for instance, I was really happy with how they handled these things because sometimes we would go in, customers would ask us, we want to use AI to automate this. And then we would look at the data and we're like, no, you can't. Let's not.
Let's not say we did if it makes you feel better.
Yeah, they're like, can't you just use the AI to? I'm like, we're like, no, you need to get your data in order. We can help you with that, right? You want to work with someone that isn't just gonna be like, yeah, let's run ahead and do something and not realize that, or ignore the fact that you're not in a good place to do it. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, sometimes I think salespeople, and it's unfortunate, it's just what they're compensated on. They have to sell.
Mm-hmm. And I think that some of it is also, at least from my experience, and call me an optimist, call me an idealist. I think that some of it is also just a lack of understanding of the business as a whole and the business process. So, even past the salespeople, say it does get the sign off and you're in it with the developers, the configurers, whoever, the engineers, depending on, if you have a low code, no code system or a fully customized system, there's just not enough knowledge of the business process to be able to call out and say, hey, these data points that you gave us don't really make sense. So we would recommend that you fix that first before we do what we're doing, because, and a lot of, I don't know the answer to this. It's very easy to say software vendors should start to teach more about supply chain and should teach more about manufacturing processes. It's very easy to say that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's, actually actionable or will work in practice, but there has to be some role or image or, somebody on the team that, and companies are leaning on the vendors to do this. So maybe that's just wrong to begin with. Maybe they're looking to the wrong person to say, hey, this isn't right. Our system is not going to work if you give us this data. Yeah. Because what happens is it's really a CYA situation and brand protection for the software, because when it doesn't work because of the bad data, the customer is going to say the software doesn't work. They're not going to say the data doesn't work. They're going to say your software didn't do what you told me it was going to do. And again, I think that a lot of that is just an underlying lack of knowledge of the impact that these data points and these inputs and outputs really have on the entire process as a whole.
Yeah, also say, of course, people are a huge part of the process, so don't discount that. So when you're starting from the standardization, right, bringing the people in the room that are affected by the process, talk about how the new process is going to work for them too. Make sure that they're on board with it. Make sure that they understand and it is actually, they feel like it is going to help them. And when I say they, I mean, you're probably going to have one or two naysayers in the room that will never be on board with any kind of automation. Ignore them, right? But the general consensus, make sure that the people that are affected by the automation are excited about, because it will never be perfect from day one. You have, whether it's a piece of hardware machinery, you have a factory acceptance test, and then it actually goes into production. The operators are the one that are going to use it. oftentimes if it's designed without their input, they're going to do workarounds immediately because it F's up the way that they normally do work. And without good change management, people
especially if they haven't, especially if no one explained why this new thing was happening. They're like, oh, well, this is annoying. I'm just going to go back to doing it the old way, if they don't know that this new way is, supposedly better and why it's better.
And talking about exceptions, right? So like in the case of automated ordering and exception handling and stuff like that, like why would you automate if most of the time it gets kicked out for errors anyway, and it needs to have a human look at it? Well, you might still shave off 10 or 15% of the work that those people need to do that can go through that happy path, right? No issues with data. Everything matches.
I'm going to start saying that, the happy path. Huh? The happy path.
And what you do is you look at, okay, I'm expecting that X percentage of my process is not going to fit the happy path, is not going to be automatable. And there will be some exception handling, right? Think about that from the start. How do we handle the exceptions? And how do we improve the system over time so that the percentage of exceptions gets lower over time? This is called, like, when you're talking about machine learning or AI, it's the concept of kind of human in the loop training. Training AI models is never done. You might train one and it might work perfectly, and then 6 months from now there will be drift in the data, or there will be recalibration needed. Like, automation systems aren't set and forget it. Like, that might be a big secret, but you can't just buy it and put it on the floor and then not maintain it for 10 years and think that everything is going to be fine. It is one of those things.
That's the case with any technology.
Yes.
I get an update pushed to my iPhone more than I would like to update my iPhone. So especially as we move into cloud environments, a lot of software is moving into the cloud. These updates get pushed, and customers don't always take the next update because they don't realize it's not set it and forget it. And they didn't have a maintenance plan. They didn't have a plan for after we automate, after we implement, and they find themselves, because they didn't plan for it, not having the headcount, not having the budget, et cetera, et cetera. So they let the software, the automation, et cetera, go stale. And then in 5 or 6 years, sometimes even 5 or 6 months, I've seen no one's even using it, and everyone's going back to the old way because it actually doesn't work anymore, because it's not keeping up with the change of the pace of the business, the industry, the market, customer expectations, et cetera.
So you got to think about all these implementations as a cycle that is never ending, right? And so you're always looking at continuous improvement of the process after you've installed it, or after you've rolled it out the first time. And just think about, okay, when there are a lot of these exceptions, how do we feed those exceptions back into the system to be trained or to be improved over time? Because otherwise you just end up with something that people will ignore, or it'll be too cumbersome, or there'll be too many exceptions. Why do we even use the system in the first place when I have to touch them all anyway? Right. But the idea, and a lot of, you can still get a ton of benefit from like automating your process to 75% and then having people handle the rest.
Nicole just reminded me that we didn't throw up the last action item. So last action item, make the go, no go automation decision. So once you've defined, standardized the process, you've documented it, calculated the cost of the process, and really talk through as a team, as an organization, all of the different factors that we've talked about. Is the data ready? What is the cost? How do I say this? Does the cost of automating outweigh the value? And not, immediately, you might have to spend a little bit more money, but in the long term, am I going to get a lot of value and impact out of automating this? Or did I actually get a lot of improvement just from doing the exercise of us all sitting together and standardizing it? And maybe we really couldn't agree on what the process was, and it doesn't make sense to automate just yet, but we can go through a couple of iterations of that standardization and get to where we need to get. So go, no go automation decision, you might not even need to automate, but you can still get those incremental improvements and optimize cost, decrease costs at some points, really find other ways to leverage people's time as opposed to doing these manual repetitive tasks. Next show is January 13th. We've got about 30 seconds left in our 45 minutes. Can't believe it went by so fast, because I did want to get to Nathan Sparks's comment, and maybe this will be a topic for some time next year. How can we build a circular supply chain with automation? High quality renewed product adds supply, extends life cycle value, and reduces environmental impacts. So very funny story, and we are going to go over a little bit today. When I was my very first industrial engineering class, one of my professors told me that there was a light bulb company that used to make really, really good light bulbs that they just went forever, and they couldn't get customers to come back to buy more light bulbs. So they reduced the quality of the light bulb so that they would come back to buy more. So I don't know if that's a true story, but it seems like we're now kind of going back the opposite route. Everything comes around full circle, because again, circular economy, sustainability, there's so much stuff. And we don't need so much stuff. There's a way to keep things going back within the supply chain, extend quality. Then let's do that. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you so much, Nikki, for making some time. Everyone have a great holiday season as we're going into the rest of December. Try to get some rest and spend time with your families, and hopefully be in better health than my family has been this week. And we will see you next year on January 13th.
Looking forward to it. Thanks for having me.